Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for coming out. I'm really happy to be here. It's nice to see some friendly faces and some old friends. I've never managed to live in San Francisco, but I've visited here for extended periods, and almost every time I've been in town, I've made a point of coming to City Lights. So it's neat to be here in this capacity. I appreciate it. I'm going to originally my plan was to sort of read the first 4 or 5 pages of this book and then have a more wide-ranging discussion. I decided not to do that. I did an event like this last week in Atlanta, and one thing is that in order to actually read the type, I have to hold the book about this close to my face, and so it looks awkward. And so I don't know if it's just my eyes are deteriorating, so I'm getting older, or masturbation. But so what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to talk through the introduction very carefully. But first I wanted to pass around a few underground newspapers. Obviously there's some people here who know a bit about the underground press, but maybe some people aren't as familiar. So I brought along 3 papers. And then these are, they're rare, but they're not that rare. You can buy an underground newspaper for $15 or $20, any day of the week on eBay. And, they're delicate, but not so much that you can't handle them. So I'm going to pass these around. This is the Los Angeles Free Press, and it was widely considered to be the first underground newspaper in the 60s. It started running in 1964, and that issue is from 1965. What's interesting about that one to me is that 65, of course, is still a few years before the youth rebellion really gets heated up. And so that paper championed an ethos of, what I call sort of high Bohemianism. There's articles in there about ballet. There's a reference to Yoko Ono, the avant-gardist, several years before she met John Lennon. They have advertisements for art house cinema and this sort of thing. Yet later the paper would be very much associated with hippies on the Sunset Strip and riots and rock and roll and things like this. But it started out a little bit more intellectually minded. This paper is familiar, I'm sure, to some people here. It's the Berkeley Barb, and this is a little more groovy. This is the summer of 1967. It's also got some very tasteful art on the back as well. And if you flip through this paper, you see. It's more psychedelically oriented. There's some articles in here that champion a kind of politics of confrontation with the police. And just about every large city underground newspaper had a classified ad section. And then today these things seem kind of run-of-the-mill with the advent of dating websites and social media and stuff. But I think these were thought to be maybe titillating to some readers in the 60s. Some of these ads are not very promising. There's one here. It says, "Wanted. A girl, 18 and up, to cook and clean house for a rock band in groovy beach pad scene." There's another one here from an endowed male in middle 30s, seeks healthy, lusty female or couples for passion. Again, these wouldn't raise an eyebrow to nowadays. There's also one here that says, "Jesus Christ is returning soon. Are you ready for the end of the world?" People never get tired of sending out that message. This last paper, Carter, you might remember. This is the Great Speckled Bird from Atlanta, where I live now. And it was one of the most distinctive papers in the South. This here, it says, this is from 1970. And so the headline here, it says, "Hard drugs suck." And I think what they were suggesting is that maybe people should use more consciousness-expanding drugs, or maybe marijuana, and maybe a little less cocaine or heroin or something. That's sort of the point. But if you still see articles in there on Woodstock, on the Black Panthers and whatnot. And so each of those papers sort of reflect the movement in different periods. I start this book with a headline from the Berkeley Tribe, dated from December 1969. And in big bold print, the headline said, "Stones concert ends it." And then in sort of the subheadline beneath that, what journalists call the deck, it said, "America now up for grabs." And it was referring to this concert that the Rolling Stones had at Altamont in December of 1969. And this was supposed to have been a triumphant affair. The Rolling Stones appeared with also Santana and the Jefferson Airplane and the Flying Burrito Brothers. And they had a hard time sort of finding a venue for this show at the last minute, so they did it at this Altamont Speedway. And overnight they built this stage that was only about 3 feet high. And it turned out to be a disaster. Thousands of people sort of clambered on top of each other to get very close to the stage. Someone had the bright idea of hiring the Hells Angels motorcycle gang to do security, and they paid them allegedly with a truckload of beer. And so the Hells Angels had shown up with pool cues and chains and knives, and it was a really violent scene. So the Hells Angels were brutalizing and beating up spectators. It probably would have been less violent if the Rolling Stones had played a little bit earlier. The concert was being filmed for a documentary called "Gimme Shelter," which you probably are familiar with. It's a great movie, in fact. But anyhow, Mick Jagger was, he was reluctant to play until it was dark because he thought he would look better underneath the stage lights. And by that point, by every account, bad vibes were sort of regnant among the concert goers, and it was just a violent, ugly scene. And the Rolling Stones could only play in fits and starts. There was commotion swirling around them. Mick Jagger is visibly nervous, trying to soothe the crowd, telling everyone that, chill out and be cool, and we're all brothers and sisters, and no one really paid much attention. And then the most violent moment happened when an African-American teenager named Meredith Hunter pulled out a gun. He was being beaten up or punched around by some of the Hells Angels. He pulled out a revolver and held it high over his head. And then in just an instant, a Hells Angel lunged over and plunged a knife between his neck and his shoulder. So he died there. And ever since then, historians have been fond of describing Altamont as a kind of generation-shattering event. And people in my field make distinctions sometimes between the early 60s and the late 60s. The early 60s is thought to be a time of idealism, and is associated with the lunch counter protests and the Beatles in their lovable mop-top phase, and JFK in his youthful vigor. And then the late 60s is often associated with urban rebellions and riots and Charles Manson and the Weather Underground and political violence, and Altamont as well. Altamont is sometimes seen as kind of a death knell for the counterculture. And what a lot of people don't realize is that trope emerged originally in the underground press. And the Berkeley tribe gave saturation coverage to this event, and stressed how disastrous it had been. And the tribe's journalists were not merely they didn't show up purely as journalists, nor did they show up at this concert as participants, but they were both. They were participants and observers. They wrote about the event in a very sort of familiar style, with a kind of hip vernacular that emerged from their own culture. And almost everything they wrote about the event struck a very portentous tone. They came away feeling deeply concerned at what had happened there, and what it all meant. At the same time, the San Francisco Examiner covered this event, and they completely missed the concert's significance. In the first articles, they stressed that there had been no violence, that the only problem associated with the conference was with the concert was the traffic headache it caused on the interstate. Later, they mentioned that Meredith Hunter had died, but they missed the fact that actually 3 other people were killed as well. 2 were run over while camping, and another person drowned while zonked out on drugs in this swift-moving irrigation canal. And then the Examiner really just fumbled as this story began to unfold. They really fumbled to explain why 300,000 people would even want to attend a concert like this in the first place. And then when they finally on, I think it was December 14th, they had an op-ed columnist who stressed that this event had been a disaster for the counterculture. But his tone was so priggish and excoriating that it's hard to imagine very many younger readers taking him seriously. He said, "Maybe it's wishful thinking, but to me that Altamont rock fiasco looked very much like the last gasp of the whole hippie drug thing. There were the Stones," he said, "peddling their idiot doggerel and primitive beat before that most mindless of animals, the human mob. Altamont was just another manifestation of, quote, the rock drug slobbery cult," to which he could only say, "good riddance." And so I use this event at the beginning of the book because I think it helps us to apprehend the powerful appeal of these underground newspapers for young readers in the 1960s. The tribe's reporters lacked any pretense of objectivity, but they put across sharply argued and forcefully written opinions that grew out of their own subculture. And then whereas the Examiner, which by the way was the flagship of the Hearst newspaper chain, used this prefabricated template. They were clearly invested in describing this event as another sort of Woodstock-style concert, and they got it completely wrong. These underground newspapers started emerging, as I say, in the mid-'60s. Someone pointed out that technically they represent maybe one of the largest and most spontaneous growths in the history of publishing. In 1965, there were 5 such newspapers. There was the Berkeley Barb and the Free Press. There's the East Village Other in New York. There's a paper called the Fifth Estate in Detroit. And then, ironically for me, and also for Matt, because we went to Michigan State, the first campus-based newspaper was called The Paper, and it was in East Lansing, Michigan. But towards the end of 1966, these papers started sprouting up quickly in every single pocket in every region of the country, And by the end of the 60s, you had literally hundreds, maybe 400 or 500 newspapers in every city, every campus, every community, with a readership that stretched into the millions combined.